Hello, Joe, from New York.
Hi, how are you? Greetings.
Hello, Joe. Very good to see you again.
Same here.
It's now a month ago, Joe, that your first book was published. It's called Searching for Home, the impact of the Second World War on a hidden child. We published it on the 5th of May, which was a very significant day, Liberation Day in Holland. And we had planned a wonderful tour at various bookshops in Holland. We had Groningen, Wageningen, and Amsterdam, but unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, it didn't take place. So now we have this alternative. We're going to chat online. Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Joe, your book, it focuses on the impact of war, of being a hidden child in war-torn Holland. As a baby of 3 or 4 months old, you were taken away from your biological parents to Wageningen, where you lived with the Dijkstra family as Pietje Dijkstra. And at the age of 3, you were, after the war ended, you were taken back by your biological parents, and you were, of course, confused. You felt abandoned by what you thought was your real mother. And this is a subject I would like to talk to you about, and that is the feeling of, abandonment of a hidden child. Can you please elaborate on that?
Well, yes. The results of that experience were so profound that for many years I questioned if my biological parents were in fact my real parents. And as a teenager, a young teenager, I sort of turned that around and made it into a running, painful joke by saying to my parents, I really adopted you. I picked you up off the street. But in it, there's a lot, because in it, there is the sense of me pouting, of me being upset, of me needing distance, and my parents having maybe needing the same kind of distance. And this is the gestalt that I went through a good part of my life. And I had to sort all of that out. As a result, when we moved to Israel, when my family no longer could stand living in post-war Holland, in part because of the recession, but also because on every street corner there was a story, a ghost of our family. And they just could not take the pain and memories. And we actually wanted to go to the USA, but we couldn't get visas. Instead, we went to Israel. But as a result, I felt uprooted all over again. And so there were layers and layers, scars upon scars, emotionally, that I felt throughout my young adult life. And Israel ended up being a phenomenal environment because I lived on a kibbutz and separate from my parents. And that separateness, in fact, created, at least temporarily, a healing process. Because there's no better learning than learning from a child your own age. You don't need an adult to walk you in one direction or another. You don't need to be spoon-fed. You have to learn from your own mistakes, from your own modeling. And so that healing process was beginning. And then, of course, we moved again. And that's part of my story, is that I could never really form strong roots. And so another phenomenon of having been in hiding was that the immigrant experience for me was that I was always the outsider. And so in some ways, not only did I feel bad about that, but in addition, I felt no responsibility for the country that I was in, namely the USA. I was more like a Greek watching the Romans doing their thing, you know? And of course, eventually I jumped in and joined the Romans in a matter of speaking, and became a citizen and someone fully responsible. But for a very long time, I did not, and I rationalized it simply that, well, they are keeping me on the margins of society, so I don't have any obligations to it either. But throughout this time, of course, as we all do, whether we're tourists or travelers or just people growing up, we carry a suitcase of our own history with us. And in that suitcase were a number of remnants of my past, and they included an ongoing streak of fearing a lot of things around me. Loud noises, for example, would shake me up, and amazingly, not knowing on its own level created anxiety and fear. And that was part of the struggle as well. It wasn't just feeling that I didn't belong, is I lacked the confidence that you would have, that almost happens automatically when roots are created within a community, when there is all the proper consistencies of a child growing up. And none of that was happening, not necessarily by calculation, sometimes simply by happenstance. My parents, like most parents of that age, were not psychologically attuned. So they had no sense of what a young, bruised, emotionally bruised child needed. There wasn't therefore the proper modeling that you would normally have in a regular, intact family.
Yeah, and they had their own problems to go
absolutely,
through.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I was left with, besides one of the photos, I'm 4 years old, standing next to a baby carriage, which happens to have my young sister in it. And I stand there pouting, a long face. And that was really what I carried on the inside through my teenagehood. And along with it, a sense of victimhood. And as I became more conscious, when I got to be 18, 20, 22 in the 1960s, that was one major hurdle I had to jump beyond, because I already began to understand that if I wallowed in my own victimhood, I wouldn't grow, I wouldn't learn, I wouldn't become anything, because all I would end up doing is bemoaning my own past and suffering in it.
Yeah.
And so it's like a person reaching a certain crossroads and saying, well, you can carry that sorrow and pain, very familiar feelings, including anger, which was maybe the first true feeling that I owned in my life, you can carry all of that in your valise and go up one road, or maybe you can not throw it away totally, but at least put it in its proper place within your psyche, within your being, and travel up a different road and take some risks along with it, which certainly out of fear I never took before. And so this became a period, the 1960s, a very profound period, a time for obviously physical travel, but also traveling within, of testing one's limits, and the true development of adulthood and maturation. So I was on this road. I was no longer living within my parents' home, including their dreams and nightmares. I was living within my own home and dreams and nightmares, and that's how it started to move forward in a more interesting way. One of the interesting facets also about being a hidden child was when I started writing this book 3 years ago, I realized suddenly that although physically I was no longer in hiding, that psychologically and mentally, I continued to be in hiding for many, many years thereafter. Never wanting to raise my hand in class, never wanting to reveal too much of my past. In fact, being embarrassed by my past. I've shared this with other hidden children, and it's interesting that they also saw those comments as familiar to their own experience. And so all of that slowly just fell in its proper place. Nothing within me is completely new. It's just transitioned and integrated in a way where either it no longer challenges me profoundly, the negative aspects, and I can lead a productive, normal life. The issue of trust is no longer a challenge, which it was certainly when I was a child and a young adult. I've been married for nearly 50 years and have a child and all of those normal good things. And the irony of being hidden is also something that hasn't escaped me. So during, for example, this COVID-19 tragic period, I realized that as a hidden child, one of the also byproducts of it was that I'm extremely vigilant. Vigilance is something that marks my life. I mean, in a restaurant, I'm always facing the door, for example, ever aware of people on either side of me, of events all around. And so in terms of this terrible state that we are now slowly overcoming, I realize I coped very well. I knew immediately what I needed to do and how to do it. And so and the same thing was true actually when sadly on September 11th in 2001, we faced the bombings on the Trade Center. Again, it's almost like genetically,
Mm.
my genes were laced by my own experience so that I could cope in a way that worked fairly well under these tragic and dramatic instances.
Right.
And so that's sort of a sort of ironic silver lining to this whole thing.
You are accustomed to danger. You know exactly what to do. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I find that I'm able to adapt to
Yes.
different circumstances. I'm able and soberly to prioritize what's most important, what's less important.
Yes.
So I'm not scattered during those periods of time.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
I think that's
Um,
pretty fascinating, Joe, because what I find is reading your book, you really get an insight into the psyche of a hidden child, you know. Even though you were extremely young, 3 months, 3 years old, so much has happened during those years. And it goes through as a red thread through your whole life, what has happened. But I find it amazing that you managed to cope so well in the end.
well, thank you. And the thing is that flexibility and adaptability obviously was also very important within that experience. I knew that if I became rigid in any form,
Yeah,
that I, you know, I may not survive.
yeah,
And that's true today as well, that you have to adapt to different circumstances.
that's a very
Exactly.
wise thing. I think I hear your dog there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
My dog Reuben.
yeah,
You
yeah,
wanna
yeah,
come up?
yeah.
Uh,
Okay, Joe, I thank you very much for this very insightful chat about your book. I love it. And it has already got a lot of reviews since 1 month that it has been published. So it's looking very good. And I thank you very much for the chat.
oh, thank you. Thank you
Okay,
very much. Bye
thank you
bye.
very much. Bye-bye. Bye.
You.